What is the Kyoto Protocol?
It is an environmental agreement signed by 141 nations that agree to work to slow global warming by limiting emissions, cutting them by 5.2% by 2012. Each nation has its own target to meet. The protocol was drawn up December 11, 1997, in the ancient capital of Kyoto, Japan, and went into effect on February 16, 2005. The United States is not among the signatories. American officials said the agreement is flawed because large developing countries including India and China were not immediately required to meet specific targets for reduction. Upon the protocol's enactment, Japan's Prime Minister called on non-signatory nations to rethink their participation, saying that there was a need for a common framework to stop global warming. Environmentalists echoed his call to action.
What was the Church's role during the Middle Ages?
Though the Roman Catholic Church became increasingly involved in secular concerns during the Middle Ages. 1350, it played a much larger part in medieval European life. Missionaries converted many of the Germanic tribes, thus the Church was influential in civilizing these so-called barbarians. Further, churches throughout Europe housed travelers and served as hospitals for the sick. Monasteries and cathedrals became centers of learning.
How old is philosophy?
Philosophy, apart from religion, emerged in the East and the West at about the same time, roughly 600 years before Christ, before the Common Era. It was then that thinkers in Greece began questioning the nature of existence. And it was c. 500 BC when Confucianism was formulated in China. Philosophy has long been intertwined with religion, including Hinduism, which developed about 1500 BC. But as a pursuit of wisdom in and of itself, philosophy is roughly 2600 years old. Western philosophy is divided into three major periods: ancient, c. 600 BC AD 400. Medieval philosophy, often called scholasticism, which also included Eastern thinkers, 400s to 1600s, and modern philosophy, since the 1600s.
Why was the Internet invented?
The computer network was invented in the late 1960s so that U.S. Department of Defense researchers could share information with each other and with other researchers. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, developed the Internet. Its users, who were mostly scientists and academics, saw the power of the new technology, wires linking computer terminals in a Web of networks allow people anywhere in the world to communicate with each other over the computer. Even though it was developed by the government, the Internet is not government-run. The Internet Society, comprised of volunteers, addresses usage and standards issues. The technology caught on, made more accessible by the innovation of the user-friendly World Wide Web. In spring 2005 there were an estimated 888 million Internet users around the world. About 35% of them in Asia, 30% in Europe, and 25% in North America, about 200 million of those in the United States. The powerful network had become part of everyday life in the developed world.
What was the French and Indian War?
The French and Indian War, 1754–63, was the last major conflict in North America before the Revolutionary War, 1775–83. During colonial times, both Britain and France had steadily expanded their territories into the Ohio River Valley. Since the fur trade prospered in this region, both countries wished to control it. But as the French encroached on their territory, the British colonists sent an ultimatum to them. This message was delivered by none other than George Washington. 1732–1799, who had been sent by the British governor. But the French made it clear that they did not intend to back down. So in 1754 Washington, now a lieutenant colonel, and 150 troops established a British outpost at present-day Pittsburgh, not far from where the French had installed themselves at Fort Duquesne. That spring and summer fighting broke out. Washington met the French, and though he and his troops mustered a strong resistance, there were early losses for the British. But a reinvigorated British force, under the leadership of Britain's Secretary of State William Pitt, 1759–1806, took French forts along the Allegheny River in western Pennsylvania and met French troops in battle at Quebec. In 1755 Washington was made colonel and led the Virginia troops in defending the frontier from French and Indian attacks. Though the British finally succeeded in occupying Fort Duquesne in 1758, at which time Washington temporarily retired to his farm in Virginia. Fighting continued until 1763 when the Treaty of Paris ended the war. The British won the spoils, gaining control of all French lands in Canada as well as French territories east of the Mississippi River, with the exception of New Orleans. The city was ceded to Spain, along with its holdings west of the Mississippi. Spain had become an ally to France late in the war. In 1762, in exchange for Havana, Cuba, Spain turned over Florida to the British. France, which had once controlled a vast region of America, retained only two small islands off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, and the two Caribbean islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe.
Who were the Molly Maguires?
They were Irish-American coal miners in eastern Pennsylvania who organized a secret society in 1854. The Molly Maguires aimed to wage a campaign of violence against mine owners and operators. The name of the group came from a society in Ireland that used physical force to fight ruthless landlords. The American miners became determined to defeat their oppressors at all costs. Their numbers grew, and in the decade following the Civil War, 1861 to 65. The Molly Maguires were active both as agitators, and it would later be revealed, as assassins. In 1875 the group incited a coal miners' strike, which was broken by the detective work of Irish-American James McParlin, 1844 to 1919. A Pinkerton guard hired by Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company to infiltrate the Molly Maguires. McParlin revealed the identities of gunmen responsible for the deaths of 9 mine company foremen. Several members of the secret society were arrested, tried and convicted, in 1876, and hanged, in 1877, for the crimes. American sympathies for the plight of the miners were diminished by the headlines proclaiming the terrorist activities of the Molly Maguires. The society dissolved by 1877. Their presence, however, was long felt in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania, where company police monitored activities in the mines and effectively intimidated many miners from organizing.
When was the first fax machine developed?
The facsimile, machine may seem like a recent invention, but it was developed long ago. It took more than 100 years for the machines to become part of everyday life. In 1842 to 1843, Scottish philosopher and psychologist Alexander Bain, 1818 to 1903, invented the first, albeit crude, fax machine. The scanning technology was improved enough by 1924 that newspapers began using the device to transmit photographs. By the 1930s, wire photos were an important component of newspaper reports. It was not until the 1980s that faxes came into widespread use, as manufacturers produced the more compact and affordable machines that are visible in most every place of business today.
How old is chess?
It dates to the Middle Ages. In 1283 Alfonso X, 1221 to 1284, King of Castile and Leon, Spain, commissioned the Libro de Ajedrez, Dados y Tablas, Book of Chess, Dice, and Backgammon, based on an Arabic text. This book is still considered an important source on leisure activities in the Middle Ages, 500-1350.
Is it true that Edison had no formal education?
It's almost true, Thomas Edison, 1847–1931, had no formal education to speak of. Born in Milan, Ohio, Edison's father moved the family to Port Huron, Michigan. In 1854, their young Edison attended school for the first time in a one-room schoolhouse where he was taught by the Reverend and Mrs. G. B. Engel. But this arrangement lasted just a few months. The boy grew impatient with his schooling behavior his teachers interpreted as a sign of mental inferiority. When Edison overheard Mrs. Engel refer to him as addled, he reported it to his mother, Nancy, who promptly withdrew him from the school. From then on his mother taught him at home. Introducing young Edison to natural philosophy, a mixture of physics, chemistry, and other sciences. He showed an inclination toward science. And by the age of 10 he was conducting original experiments in the family's home. Edison furthered his education through voracious reading. He sought, and was granted, permission to sell periodicals, snacks, and tobacco to passengers on the train between Port Huron and Detroit, Michigan, some 60 miles away. During the layover in downtown Detroit, Edison spent his time at the public library, where, according to his own recollection, he read not a few books, but the entire library. Even though he lacked a formal education, Edison possessed a keen mind and a natural curiosity. Further, he had the benefit of the schooling provided by his mother as well as access to a library, of which he took full advantage. Then something happened that changed Edison's life. While still a young man, he lost his hearing. Biographer Matthew Josephson explains that the deafness had two effects on Edison. Not only did he become more solitary and shy, but Edison turned with an even greater intensity toward his studies and began to put forth tremendous efforts at self-education, for he had absolutely to learn everything for himself.
Who invented basketball?
The ball and hoop game was invented by Canadian-American James Naismith, 1861–1939, in December 1891. An instructor at the YMCA College in Springfield, Massachusetts, Naismith was asked by the head of the physical education department to come up with a game to keep students active indoors during the winter months. It had to fit inside the confines of a gym, have no physical contact, use a soft ball, and give everyone who participated a chance to handle the ball. Naismith nailed 2 peach baskets, which he found in the storeroom, to balcony railings at each end of the school's gym. Found a soccer ball, divided his class of 18 men into 2 teams, and introduced the man as it would turn out. The rest of the world to the game, which was later dubbed basketball, 2 words. Improvements to the game came over the next 2 decades as it spread in popularity. In 1910 the important change of allowing ball handlers to move by dribbling was made. In 1916 the rules were changed to allow dribblers to shoot the ball.
What is known about the Celts prior to the Roman Empire?
Before Europe was conquered by Rome, Celts, who were themselves divided into smaller tribes, had become rather advanced in many ways. Their society was divided among three classes: commoners, the educated, and aristocrats. They formed loose federations of tribes, raised crops and livestock, used the Greek alphabet to write their own language, and were among the first peoples in northern Europe to make iron. They also developed a form of metalwork that most people today recognize as Celtic, called Latin. They never formed one united nation, however, so that when Roman armies swept across Europe, the Celtic tribes were overrun.
How old is the Great Wall of China?
The immense structure, built as a barricade of protection against invasion, was begun during the 3rd century B.C. by Emperor Shi Huangti, Chen, c. 259 to 210 BC, of the Chen dynasty, and was expanded over the course of succeeding centuries. The wall stretches 1,500 miles, ranges in height between 20 to 50 feet, and is between 15 and 25 feet thick. In the 13th century, the wall was penetrated when Mongols conquered China, expanding their empire across all of Asia.
What caused the Russo-Japanese War?
From 1904 to 1905 the war was fought by Russia and Japan over their interests in China, particularly Manchuria and Korea, areas of strategic importance to each country. Before fighting broke out, Japan moved to settle the conflict, but the overture was rejected by Tsar Nicholas II. 1868 to 1918, and Japan soon severed all diplomatic relations, on February 6, 1904, with Russia. 2 days later the Japanese issued a surprise attack on Russian ships at Lushan, Port Arthur, Manchuria. On February 10 Japan officially declared itself at war with Russia. The battles both on land and at sea went badly for the Russian forces, which could not be adequately reinforced or supplied to meet the powerful and disciplined Japanese. Early in 1905, the war effort already unpopular back home, revolution broke out in Russia, further weakening the country's resolve. After an 8-month siege at Lushan, it became clear that Russia could no longer muster a fight. Further, the war was expensive for Japan, which sought the intervention of the United States in settling the conflict. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, became involved in mediating the dispute. A peace treaty was signed September 5, 1905, at a shipyard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, following 1 month of deliberations. The terms of the treaty were these: both nations agreed to evacuate Manchuria, Russia ceded to Japan the southern half of Sakhalin Island, which lies between the two countries. The island was ceded back to Russia after World War II. Korea became a Japanese protectorate, and Russia transferred to Japan the lease of China's Liaodong Peninsula. And so Japan emerged as a power onto the world scene.
How did cable TV develop?
The industry had its beginnings in the 1970s, when home box office HBO started to beam its signal to customers on a subscription basis. It was a radical concept: let audiences pay direct for the programming, in this case, movies, rather than having it wholly supported through advertising and, in some cases, syndication fees. Another development during that decade proved to have lasting effect: Southern businessman Ted Turner, 1938, bought an independent TV station based in Atlanta and dubbed it a superstation. WTBS was soon made available to some 10 million subscribing households and was the beginning of Turner's cable TV empire, which would later include cable news network, CNN, CNN's headline news, Turner Network Television, TNT, and, briefly, the music network VH1. Soon there were a number of niche-based cable networks airing programming around the clock: music television, MTV, was reaching teens and 20-somethings, Lifetime targeted women, ESPN focused on sports, black entertainment television, BET, catered to the African American audience, and American movie classics, AMC, appealed to a cross-section of American viewers who share a fondness for old, mostly black and white, movies. By the 1980s, the three major television networks, which had risen to power in the 1950s and had remained on the top of their game for the next 2 decades, found that their audience share was dropping. This was aided by the introduction of the upstart Fox television network, backed by media mogul Rupert Murdoch, 1931. Fox's programming, geared toward a young, hip, and increasingly multicultural audience, found its own following. Soon Americans had more choices than ever before, and for a relatively low subscription cost. By the 1990s, the big three networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, were reaching only 61% of the television audience. Not to be beaten at their own game, the networks responded to the new competition by producing more cutting-edge shows, programs that likely would not have made it on the air before the advent of cable. Further, they began charging their affiliate stations for programming, a trend begun by CBS in 1992.
Was the Titanic the most disastrous shipwreck of all time?
Though it is certainly the most famous, it is not the most disastrous. According to shipping registries, 3 wrecks were worse than the Titanic. In April 1865 the sidewheel steamboat Sultana exploded on the Mississippi River, killing 1,653 of the estimated 2,300 people on board. The packet steamboat had routinely carried passengers and cargo between St. Louis and New Orleans. In 1917 the Mont Blanc exploded in the harbor at Halifax, Nova Scotia, claiming 1,635 lives and severely injuring more than 1,000. The ship, which was a French munitions carrier. World War I was raging at the time, was struck by a Norwegian relief ship, the Imo. The Mont Blanc was laden with thousands of tons of TNT, acid, and other explosives, which were ignited in the collision. The explosion was so terrific that it laid waste to much of Halifax and generated a tsunami that swept through the city. Most recently, in 1987, the Dona Paz collided with another ship off the Philippines, 1,840 died.
What is the history of the Ku Klux Klan?
The Ku Klux Klan, KKK, is a white supremacist group originally formed in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. When Confederate Army veterans formed what they called a social club. The first leader, called the Grand Wizard, was Nathan Bedford Forrest, 1821–1877. A former general in the Confederate Army, who, on April 12, 1864, in the final days of the Civil War, led a massacre of 300 black soldiers in service of the Union Army at Fort Pillow, Tennessee. As the unofficial arm of resistance against Republican efforts to restore the nation and make full citizens of its black, formerly slave, population, the Ku Klux Klan waged a campaign of terror against blacks in the South during Reconstruction. 1865–77, the 12-year period of rebuilding that followed the Civil War. Klan members, cloaked in robes and hoods to disguise their identity, threatened, beat, and killed numerous blacks, while the group deprived its victims of their rights as citizens. Their intent was also to intimidate the entire black population and keep them out of politics. White people who supported the federal government's measures to extend rights to all black citizens also became the victims of the fearsome Klan. Membership in the group grew quickly, and the Ku Klux Klan soon had a presence throughout the South. In 1871 the U.S. Congress passed the Force Bill, giving President Ulysses S. Grant, 1822–1885, authority to direct federal troops against the Klan. The action was successful, causing the group to disappear but only for a time. In 1915 the society was newly organized at Stone Mountain, Georgia, as a Protestant fraternal organization, called the Invisible Empire, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan Incorporated. This time widening its focus of persecution to include Roman Catholics, immigrants, and Jews, as well as blacks. Members of all of these groups became the target of KKK harassment. which now included torture, whippings, and public lynchings. The group, which proclaimed its mission of racial purity, grew in number and became national, electing its own to public office in many states, not just the South. But the society's acts of violence raised the public ire, and by the 1940s, America's attention focused on World War II, 1939–45, and the Klan died out or went completely underground. The group had another resurgence during the 1950s and into the early 1970s. As the nation struggled through the era of civil rights, the Klan still exists today, fostering the extremist views of its membership, and staging marches to demonstrate its presence on the American landscape. Such demonstrations are often attended by protesters.
Were there any other airship disasters before Hindenburg?
Yes, as Hugo Eckener, 1868–1954, and his Zeppelin company laid plans in 1934 to build the large and luxurious Hindenburg. Most other nations with airship programs had either abandoned them or were about to, since all had experienced disastrous and fatal crashes. One of these was when a British dirigible R-101 burned on October 5, 1930. Northwest of Paris while on her maiden voyage to Australia. That disaster claimed 54 lives.
Why did John Hancock go down in history as the notable signer of the Declaration of Independence?
Most Americans know that when they're putting their John Hancock on something, it means they're signing a document. It's because of the 56 men who signed their names to the historic document. It was Hancock, 1737–1793, who, as president of the Second Continental Congress, signed the Declaration first. The events were as follows. On July 2, 1776, Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, presented the draft of the Declaration to the Second Continental Congress, which had convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, more than a year earlier, on May 10, 1775. The congressional delegates of the 13 colonies then deliberated and debated the draft, making some changes. A section was deleted that condemned England's King George III, 1738–1820, for encouraging slave trade. Other changes were cosmetic in nature. On July 4 the final draft of the Declaration was adopted by Congress. And it was then that it was signed by Hancock. The document was then printed. A few days later, on July 8, the Declaration was read to a crowd who assembled in the yard of the State House. On July 19 the Congress ordered that the Declaration of Independence be written in script on parchment. It is that copy that in early August was signed by all 56 members of the Second Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence is housed, along with the U.S. Constitution, 1788, and the Bill of Rights, 1791, in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., where it is on display to the public. John Hancock went on to become governor of Massachusetts, from 1780 to 1785 and from 1787 to 1793.
What was Al Capone tried for?
Notorious American gangster Alphonse Scarface Al Capone, 1899 to 1947. Whose crime syndicate terrorized Chicago in the 1920s, was brought to trial for income tax evasion. After Chicago police had been unable to bring Capone to justice for his criminal activities, which included trafficking bootleg liquor, gambling, prostitution, and murder, the Federal Bureau of Investigation determined that the only way to prosecute the crime boss would be through violation of the tax laws. For 2.5 weeks in October 1931, the case against Capone was heard in a Chicago courtroom. He was found guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion, sentenced to 11 years in prison, and charged $50,000 in fines and $30,000 in court costs. While his first jail cell, in Illinois' Cook County Jail, allowed him the luxuries of a private shower, phone conversations, telegrams, and even visits by other gangsters, including Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz. Capone was eventually moved to Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, where he received no privileges. Released in 1939, Capone lived out his remaining years with his wife and son in Miami Beach, where he was reportedly haunted by imaginary killers.
What were wildcat banks?
Wildcat banks were state-chartered financial institutions that operated in the United States from the early 1800s until the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. They were known as wildcat banks for their free lending policies and their issue of paper currency that could not be backed up by gold or silver, called specie. The Second National Bank of the United States operated between 1816 and 1836, during which time the federally controlled bank was able to restrain the wildcat institutions, which predominated in the West and South, requiring them to issue only what currency they could convert to coin. But when the charter of the Second National Bank of the United States was allowed to expire in 1836, the wildcat banks resumed their unsound banking practices. Paper currency issue and lending went unregulated amidst a rush to buy lands on the frontier. The nation's currency wildly fluctuated as the renegade financial institutions loosened and tightened the money supply to suit their own needs. Further, since there were so many banks issuing their own notes, another problem introduced itself: counterfeiting. No one could tell what was true bank currency and what was the product of a good counterfeiter. With inflation rampant and land speculation at a new high, on July 11, 1836, President Andrew Jackson 1767 to 1845, intent on reigning in the wildcat banks, issued the Specie Circular. An order that government agents accept nothing but gold or silver as payment for new lands. When prospective land buyers, particularly in the West, took their paper bills to the state-chartered banks to be converted to coin, they found the banks' tills were empty, and the holders were therefore denied the face value of their notes. Bank after bank closed its doors, causing a financial panic in 1837. But many state banks remained in business, and the issue of regulating paper currency continued to trouble the nation.
What were the effects of the Industrial Revolution?
The dawn of the Industrial Revolution spelled the end of home or workshop-based production. Factories were built to house the new machines, causing a population shift from rural to developing urban areas by the mid-1800s, as people went where the work was. Factory owners turned to child labor, and in the United States, to the steady influx of immigrants to run the machinery in their plants. As industry grew, it required financial institutions that could provide money for expansion, thus giving birth to a new breed of wealthy business leaders, including the extraordinarily prosperous robber barons, the industrial and financial tycoons of the late 19th century. But as industry evolved, government and policy changes did not keep pace. Serious social, political, and economic problems resulted, including poor and often dangerous working conditions, exploitation of workers, including child laborers, overcrowded housing, pollution, corruption, industry monopolies, and a widening gap between the rich and the poor. Change was slow to come, but social activism and government reforms in the late 1800s and during the progressive era of the early 1900s, much of which centered around trade unions, alleviated these problems. The rapid development of industry caused sweeping social changes. The Western world, which had long been agriculturally based, became an industrial society where goods and services are the primary focus.
When did modern surgery begin?
Modern surgical techniques were developed during the late Renaissance, largely owing to the work of one man. French surgeon Ambroise Paré, 1510 to 1590, called the father of modern surgery. Prior to Paré's life work, physicians had regarded surgery as something lowly. They left this dirty work to barber surgeons. As a young man living in the French countryside, Paré became apprenticed to one such barber surgeon. When he was only 19 years old, Paré entered Paris's Hôtel Dieu hospital to study surgery. Becoming a master surgeon by 1536, he later served as an army surgeon and then as physician to four 16th-century French kings Henry II, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. Paré also built a flourishing surgical practice and authored works on anatomy. surgery, the plague, obstetrics, and the treatment of wounds. Opposing the common practice of cauterizing, burning, wounds with boiling oil to prevent infection. He introduced the method of applying a mild ointment and allowing the wound to heal naturally. Peer was renowned for his patient care, which he based on his personal credo, "I dressed him, God cured him."
How old are card games?
Card games are believed to have originated in China in about a.d. 800. By the late 1200s, cards had made their way to Italy, perhaps carried aboard merchant ships, and from there spread to other parts of Europe. The present-day variety of four suits, hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades was adopted in France during the 1500s.
Citizens were encouraged to build bomb shelters. School children participated in air raid drills. Civil defense films, such as How Can I Stay Alive in an Atom Bomb Blast?
Were screened, and entire towns conducted tests of how residents would respond in the event of an A-bomb. Meantime, the leak of top-secret information from the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, New Mexico, was traced to New York City machine shop owner Julius Rosenberg, his wife, and her brother, David Greenglass. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin writes that the short, plump Mrs. Rosenberg looked more like one of my friend's mothers than an international spy. Indeed, the case marked the first time American civilians were charged with espionage, and the trial made international headlines. Though the Rosenbergs were only two of many involved in the conspiracy, theirs was the heaviest of the punishments handed down in the cases against the spy ring. For their betrayal and their refusal to talk, the Rosenbergs were sentenced to death. In issuing the sentence, Judge Irving Kaufman accused the couple of having altered the course of history. The penalty rocked the world, as Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter put it. They were tried for conspiracy and sentenced for treason. They were electrocuted the evening of June 19, 1953, as New York's Union Square filled with an estimated 10,000 protesters.
When was photography established as an art form?
In the early 1900s. Alfred Stieglitz, 1864 to 1946, is the acknowledged father of modern photography. His interest in the medium began when he was just a toddler, at the age of 2. He became obsessed with a photo of his cousin, carrying it with him at all times. When he was 9 years old, he took exception to a professional photographer's practice of using pigment to color a black and white photo, complaining that this spoiled the quality of the print. Between 1887 and 1911 Stieglitz worked to establish photography as a valid form of artistic expression, a pursuit for which he was sometimes publicly derided. He believed that photography should be separate from painting, but on an equal footing as an art form. He also strove to differentiate photography by instilling it with an American essence. The streets of New York City became his subject. By the time Stieglitz founded the Photo Secession Group in 1902, he had developed a uniquely American art form. Stieglitz also published and edited photography magazines, most notably Camera Work, 1903-17. After an unhappy first marriage, in 1924, Stieglitz married American artist Georgia O'Keeffe. 1887-1986, who became the subject of one of his best-known series of works.
How old is comedy?
Like tragedy, comedy as a form of drama dates back to ancient Greece. While tragedy was meant to engage human emotions, thereby cleansing spectators of their fears. According to Aristotle, comedy's intent was simply to entertain and amuse audiences. Athenian poet Aristophanes, who flourished circa the 5th century BC, is considered the greatest ancient writer of comedy. His plays, written for the festival of Dionysus, the god of fertility, wine, and, later, drama, were a mix of social, political, and literary satire. Performance vehicles included farce, parody, and fantasy. During the 4th century BC, this old comedy evolved into a new comedy, which was less biting and more romantic and realistic in nature. New comedy, which was marked by strong character development and often subtle humor, includes the works of Greek playwright Menander, flourished during the 4th century BC, and those of Roman comic writers Plautus, flourished 3rd century BC, and Terence, flourished 2nd century BC, all of whom were influences on Ben Jonson. William Shakespeare, Jean Molière, and other writers of the 16th and 17th centuries.
How did Eli Whitney invent the cotton gin?
American inventor Eli Whitney, 1765-1825, is credited with developing the cotton gin, a machine that removes cotton seeds from cotton fibers. A simple cotton gin, called the churka, dates back to ancient India. 300 BC. But Whitney's gin would prove to be far superior. In 1792 Whitney, who had recently graduated from Yale University, was visiting the Georgia plantation owned by Catherine Littlefield Greene, widow of American Revolution, 1775-83, hero General Nathaniel Greene, 1742-1786. Whitney observed that short staple, or upland, cotton which has green seeds that are difficult to separate from the fiber, differs from long staple. Also called sea island, cotton, which has black seeds that are easily separated. The latter was the staple of American commerce at the time. In 1793 Whitney, who is described as a mechanical genius, completed an invention that could be used to clean bowls of short staple cotton of their seeds. He patented it the next year. The machine worked by turning a crank, which caused a cylinder covered with wire teeth to revolve. The teeth pulled the cotton fiber, carrying it through slots in the cylinder as it revolved. Since the slots were too small for the seeds, they were left behind. A roller with brushes then removed the fibers from the wire teeth. The cotton gin revolutionized the American textiles industry, which was then but a fledgling concern. The increase in cotton production was as much as 50-fold. One large gin could process 50 times the cotton that a slave laborer could in a day. Soon plantations and farms were supplying huge amounts of cotton to textile mills in the Northeast, where in 1790 another inventor, British-born industrialist Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835, had built the first successful water-powered machines for spinning cotton. Together the inventions founded the American cotton industry. Whitney struggled to protect his patent, but imitations of his invention were already in production, prompting the U.S. government to allow his patent to expire. Though he did not profit from his cotton gin, he went on to devise a system of interchangeable parts, which introduced the idea of mass production and revolutionized manufacturing.
What is an infidel?
Derived from the Latin infidelis, meaning unbelieving or unfaithful. The term was used by the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, 500-1350, to describe a threat posed by Muslims, as the Moors. Muslims from North Africa moved into Spain early in the 8th century, and the Seljuk Turks conquered much of Asia Minor during the 11th century. Medieval Christians, of which there were a growing number, became increasingly fearful of growing Muslim influence. Not only were people of the Islamic faith occupying lands that were formerly Christian, they soon prevented Christian pilgrims from entering their holy land in the Middle East. The Church responded to the so-called infidels by inspiring Western Europeans to take up arms in the Crusades, which began in 1095 and ended unsuccessfully in 1291. In another effort to drive back Muslim expansion, in 1231 Pope Gregory IX, c. 1170 to 1241, issued a papal bull creating the Inquisition, the system by which heretics were discovered and punished. Many of them were burned at the stake. The Moorish dominance of the Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain and Portugal, lasted hundreds of years before the North Africans were driven out by armies of the Christian states. Thereafter, during the reign of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Spain embarked on a period of profound suspicion. It conducted the Spanish Inquisition, by which anyone thought to be an infidel. The definition, now broadened to include Jews, was discovered and punished.
What was the kitchen cabinet?
It was the name given to President Andrew Jackson's unofficial group of advisors, who reportedly met with him in the White House kitchen. The group included the then Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, 1782 to 1862, who went on to become Vice President, during Jackson's second term, and President from 1837 to 1841, F. P. Blair. 1791 to 1876, editor of the Washington Post, who was active in American politics and later helped get Abraham Lincoln elected to office, 1860, and Amos Kendall, 1789 to 1869. A journalist who was also a speechwriter for Jackson and went on to become U.S. Postmaster General. The kitchen cabinet was influential in formulating policy during Jackson's first term, 1829 to 33. Many believe because the president's real cabinet, which he convened infrequently, had proved ineffective. But Jackson, the seventh President of the United States, drew harsh criticism for relying on his cronies in this way. When he reorganized the cabinet in 1831, the kitchen cabinet disbanded. Jackson's favoritism to his circle of friends did not end with the kitchen cabinet, however. During his presidency, the spoils system was in full force. Jackson gave public offices as rewards to many of his loyal supporters. Though the term spoils system was popularized during Jackson's terms in office, it was his friend, Senator William Marcy, who coined the phrase when he stated, "To the victor belong the spoils of the enemy." Jackson was not the first president to grant political powers to his party's members, and the practice continued through the 19th century. However, beginning in 1883, laws were passed that gradually put an end to, or at least limited, the spoils system.
What was the crisis in Darfur, Sudan?
The brutal violence, really a genocide, in Darfur began in February 2003 and was still ongoing 2 years later as United Nations, UN, negotiators tried to broker a peace agreement. Sudanese government troops and government-backed Arab militia, called the Janjaweed, were engaged in a violent campaign that targeted black African civilians from the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa ethnic groups in the western Sudanese state of Darfur, which is about the size of Texas. Reports from the Human Rights Watch and UN agencies working in Sudan indicated that large-scale bombing and burning campaigns had destroyed entire villages, tens of thousands of Darfurians had been raped and killed, and as many as 2 million had been displaced by early 2005. International relief efforts were hampered by ongoing violence. putting millions of women and children at risk of starvation and disease. Observers called for an international response to the crisis to avert another Rwanda. In April 2005, the UN Security Council referred the Darfur situation to the International Criminal Court. But to date, no one had been able to stop the campaign of ethnic cleansing. The Darfur crisis was part of a greater and older conflict in Sudan. The East African nation, whose neighbors include Egypt to the north and Ethiopia to the east, was in 2005 the scene of Africa's oldest civil war. The conflict had pit the Arab, Muslim, north against the Christian and animist south since 1984, but diplomatic efforts to resolve that decades-old conflict had so far failed in 2005. The Muslim regime based in the national capital of Khartoum was unwilling to share power and wealth. Thus, when Khartoum was hit with a rebellion in 2003, it retaliated by inciting the brutality in Darfur. Diplomats worked to resolve the North-South civil conflict, offering Sudan a package of debt relief and development aid that could reach $100 million. Critics of that plan said that incentives were not enough, and that sanctions should be levied against the nation to pressure the government to move toward ceasefire.
What was Teapot Dome?
Teapot Dome was a notorious political scandal that was on a level with Watergate, 1972. While the early 1920s abuses of power affected President Warren G. Harding, 1865 to 1923, it was not Harding who was implicated in the crimes. Albert Bacon Fall, 1861 to 1944, Harding's Secretary of the Interior, secretly transferred government oil lands at Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to private use, and he did so without a formal bidding process. Fall leased the Elk Hills naval oil reserves to American businessman Edward L. Doheny, 1856 to 1935, in exchange for an interest-free loan of $100,000. Fall made a similar arrangement with another businessman, Harry F. Sinclair, 1876 to 1956, of Sinclair Oil Corporation, leasing the Teapot Dome reserves in exchange for $300,000 in cash, bonds, and livestock. The scandal was revealed in 1922, and committees of the U.S. Senate and a special commission spent the next 6 years sorting it all out. By the time the hearings and investigations were concluded in 1928, Harding had died. Fall had resigned from office and taken a job working for Sinclair. All three players, Doheny, Sinclair, and Fall, had faced charges, and the government had successfully sued the oil companies for the return of the lands. The punishments were light considering the serious nature of the charges. Fall was convicted of accepting a bribe, fined $100,000, and sentenced to a year in prison. While Doheny and Sinclair were both indicted but later acquitted of the charges against them, which included conspiracy and bribery.
Why is Aristotle considered one of the greatest minds in Western history?
The system of philosophy that Aristotle, 384 to 322 c. developed became the foundation for European philosophy, theology, science, and literature. The Aristotelian system may be so much a part of the fabric of Western culture that the only effective way to describe his philosophy is through example. Among his writings on logic is organon, meaning tool or instrument. Here he defines the fundamental rules for making an argument. While other thinkers may well have formulated the argument before Aristotle, no one had made a systematic study of it. In Organon, Aristotle puts forth a method for coming to a conclusion based on circumstantial evidence and prior conclusions rather than on the basis of direct observation. This deductive scheme, called a syllogism, is made up of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. For example, every virtue is laudable, major premise, courage is a virtue. Minor premise, therefore courage is laudable, conclusion. It is worth noting, however, that the belief in deductive logic was later rejected by English philosopher Sir Francis Bacon 1561 to 1626 in 1620, in favor of an inductive system, or one that is based on observation. In Poetics, Aristotle expounded upon his literary views. He maintained that epic and tragedy portray human beings as nobler than they truly are, while comedy portrays them as less noble than they are. In order to explain how tragedy speaks to the emotions of the spectator, Aristotle introduced the idea of catharsis. He separated tragedy from epic with the distinction that tragedy maintains unity of plot. Later translated as unity of plot, time, and place, while the epic does not. Because of the keen understanding evident in Poetics, the work has illuminated literary criticism since antiquity. In addition to logic and rhetoric, Aristotle wrote on natural science, physics, on the heavens, parts of animals, and on plants, and on ethics and politics, politics. His great philosophical work was Metaphysics, so named because, in the body of his works, it comes after, the Greek word for which is meta, the work physics. Metaphysics as a philosophy is the study of substance, or the nature and structure of reality. It is considered one of 5 major branches of Western philosophy. In modern thought, metaphysics can include many disciplines, such as cosmology, the study of the origins and structure of the universe, and theology, the study of religion. Most of the great philosopher's writings are compilations of notes from lectures he delivered to his students at the Lyceum, also called the Peripatetic School, in Athens. Among his pupils there were Greek leaders, including Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC.
What is black gold?
Black gold is a term for oil or petroleum black because of its appearance when it comes out of the ground. And gold because it made prospectors, drillers, and oil industry men rich. The oil industry in the United States began in 1859 when retired railroad conductor Edwin L. Drake, 1819 to 1880, drilled a well near Titusville, Pennsylvania. His drill, powered by an old steam engine, struck oil. Oil from animal tallow and whales had been used as a lubricant since colonial times. The discovery of a process for deriving kerosene, a clean-burning and easy-lighting fuel, from coal oil had been patented in 1854. After Drake's Titusville well produced shale oil. The substance was analyzed for its properties and it, too, was determined to be an excellent source of kerosene. Soon others began prospecting for rock oil. Western Pennsylvania became an important oil-producing region. Wagons and river barges transported barrels to market. Later, the railroad reached into the region. And by 1875 a pipeline was built to carry the oil directly to Pittsburgh. Petroleum products soon replaced whale oil as a fluid for illumination. During the 1880s, Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, and Indiana also produced oil. In 1901 the famous Spindletop field in eastern Texas produced the nation's first gusher. Oil literally sprang out of the earth. During the next decade, California and Oklahoma joined Texas to lead the nation's oil production. Between 1859 and 1900, U.S. oil production boomed. Just 2,000 barrels were produced the year it was discovered in Pennsylvania. More than 64 million barrels were produced annually by the turn of the century. The second half of the 1800s saw the oil industry boom. The fuel was used for lighting, heating, and lubrication, principally of machinery and tools. But the advent of the automobile and its central role in the life of 20th century America made the oil industry richer yet. Demand soon exceeded the nation's supply of petroleum, prompting the United States to increasingly rely on imported oil for fuel.
Who is the enemy of the day?
Terrorists. News stories reinforce that this catch-all term does not only include the 9/11 hijackers and their Al-Qaeda associates, the Madrid and London train bombers, and suicide bombers in Gaza, but anti-government extremists who blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City, a still unknown distributor of deadly anthrax, and animal rights activists who routinely damage property to make a point. Terrorism is a decades, some might argue, centuries, old problem. Remember Birmingham, Alabama 16th Street Baptist Church, bombed in 1963 by white supremacists during Sunday services. Remember the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, when the Arab terrorist group Black September killed 11 Israeli athletes held captive in the Olympic Village. Remember the October 1985 hijacking of the Achille Lauro cruise ship by members of the Palestinian Liberation Front, who killed a wheelchair-bound American Jew. Remember the December 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, which came down in Lockerbie, Scotland, claiming 270 lives. The list is long and growing. The shocking events of September 11, 2001, centered the world's attention on the problem of well-financed terrorist networks that can turn the freedoms of democracy against civilians and who are feared to have in their possession or access to powerful weapons of mass destruction, WMD. The events of that day launched what the US government calls the global war on terrorism. A long battle that even the president acknowledged may not be winnable in a traditional sense. This is a new kind of war, fought not against a nation, but against anarchists halfway around the world. And in our midst, globalization and terrorism are the twin concerns of the modern era.